All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, 1990, President George H.W. Bush signs the American with Disabilities Act, the ADA. At the signing, Bush said that the act, quote, promises to open up all aspects of American life to individuals with disabilities, employment opportunities, government services, public accommodations, transportation, and telecommunications. And it really was that sweeping, touching all aspects of our life. It's a little hard to imagine life before the ADA. And I guess that's where we will start this episode, looking at life before the ADA, why it took Bush to finally get this legislation done, and how things have changed and the legacy of that act. Here to do that, as always, are Nicole Hammer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
We were just remarking before we started taping about how 1990 seemed sort of late for this to happen. And part of the story here is that took decades and decades of activism and legislative battles to get into place. But if we do pick 1990 as our sort of point here where things started to change, to what I said in the intro, let's paint a little picture of life before the ADA, but maybe we take for granted some of the things that it has changed.
Right. Before the ADA, people didn't necessarily see design as the problem. They thought that a disability was a problem, and that if people had difficulty getting around, it was because of their disability, not because of the design of a sidewalk or the design of a parking lot or the design of stairs. And so you could imagine for somebody who was, say, in a wheelchair, unable to walk on their own, that they would constantly be confronted with buildings that had stairs and no ramps, that they would, if they could go to a hotel and get a room, they wouldn't necessarily be able to get in the bathtub or use the shower or use the bathroom, that they'd be on a sidewalk and they'd have to go over the bump in order to get up.
Curb.
There wouldn't be any kind of like ramp to make it easier. And so life was just much, much more difficult, and there were certain places that people couldn't get into, or if they could get into it, that they weren't welcome into.
Yeah. It's also incredible because the Disabilities Act doesn't just help people with disabilities. I think about having, a stroller as a mom and trying to get on the subway or trying to get anywhere really that has steps is incredibly difficult. Navigating cities were so much more harder when you didn't have, this legislation put in place. And so we take so much of it for granted today, but it really does impact every facet of our lives.
That's one of the things that really strikes me about this is how much I think, from a political standpoint and advocacy standpoint, you have to frame this as disability rights. But, the fact that, as you just said, it affects so many people, voice recognition technology, subtitling, accommodations on streets that end up being, used by bikers or people pushing strollers, as you said. And I just feel like that's the case with so much legislation, and so that I sometimes get frustrated. I think about sort of climate legislation, and we think of it as like environmental legislation when really like it's going to touch everything, and it's as much an economic initiatives as it is anything else. And so like this is one where it's just a clear example that like this changed everything, even though it was targeted in this way.
But it was such a long, hard fight to get this legislation for something that seems so common sense and so much a part of the, the landscape of our lives. It was really difficult. I mean, disabilities activists had been working for years to get this legislation. And there were some, changes along the way. But, it's worth talking about all of the activism that went into it and how they really pushed to get this through.
Yeah, this was a movement that was explicitly modeled after the Black Civil Rights Movement. The idea of both constant lobbying using civil disobedience, so things like sit-ins, but also really dramatic visual moments. And so, for instance, one of these was a mayor in Houston was trying to show, people should use buses more. So we're going to have this day when I ride the bus. And so there were all of these television cameras there. And 40 people in wheelchairs show up and they can't get on the bus because the only way onto the bus is through the steps. And so you have this media event where everyone sees it. And I think probably the biggest example of this is in 1990, the Capitol Crawl, when people who aren't able to use stairs go to the Capitol building and drag themselves up the stairs in front of cameras to both visually represent these stairs are an obstacle that keep us out, but to do it at the U.S. Capitol at a moment when the ADA is sort of waiting in the legislative chamber is to call attention to political as well as physical barriers.
Yeah, that the imagery of that is just so sobering, right? To see people crawling, really on their arms and hands trying to get up all the steps. And if anyone's seen the steps of the Capitol, it's not like 5 or 6 steps. It's hundreds of steps. It's just so powerful. Like I think about the performative aspect of like sit-ins and of, a lot of the tools that we saw with ACT UP, how they use these sort of performative ways to get people to pay attention. Disability activists are doing the exact same thing. And it's really convincing and compelling when you see someone actively struggling in that way.
And actually, this, no surprise, I mean, it's 1990 when this finally goes through. It does fold into a lot of the AIDS activism of the time, which we'll get to. But, just to highlight the long fight here, there were these sit-ins and so forth going on from the 70s. There was legislation in 1977 that was sort of considered the basis of the ADA. And then to paint the sort of scope of what happens is, Reagan comes in and basically there's deregulation efforts all around. And so Reagan really gets in the way of a lot of the momentum on the part of activists and some of the sort of initial legal provisions. And a really interesting thing happens in 1988, which is that there are anti-discrimination provisions, disability anti-discrimination provisions that are worked into the Fair Housing Act. And I think that's such an object lesson in the fact that like so many times these efforts work their way they do an end around. They work their way into other bills, and then they set precedent, and they show that these things are priorities. And so the fact that you can see that there's a legislative strategy here to work it into housing, and then eventually continue that momentum and lead to a larger sweeping bill.
And it's not just housing. I mean, we think about elevators and ramps, and that's really important. But it's also about employment. It's about jobs. People who have disabilities have a right to be able to get hired and work anywhere and be able to access that job in a way that allows them to earn income and live their lives as full as any other American citizen. And so there's big parts of this legislation that don't just protect sort of like the public spaces that we think of, but how people have access to jobs and employment and can't be discriminated against in the hiring practices. That's also a big deal.
And you can start to understand why this then takes so long, even though there's a robust movement by the 1970s. There are some protections put in place in 1973, and then you get a Supreme Court case in 1978 that took away a lot of the power to enforce anti-discrimination provisions. And so then people with disabilities become part of a broader civil rights coalition that's working to restore those rights during the Reagan era, which is a very difficult time because it's seen as pro-business to be, in a way, pro-discrimination, right? The businesses should be able to do what they want. And so it really
they
does
shouldn't have to accommodate anyone.
Exactly. And so it really does take finding a champion in the administration to start making change happen.
And to that point, a lot of there's a mix here of carrots and sticks, right? And a lot of the business, a lot of the sort of provisions in the final ADA are penalties or give people recourse to sue employers who discriminate on the basis of this. But then there are also incentives to build ramps and other accommodations. And there's laws about service animals and so forth. So, it really is a remarkable bill in that regard. It was rocky in that moment, and there were objections, including, it looks like, from our pal Jesse Helms, who has showed up a few times and was a target of ACT UP in many ways. And he tried to work in amendments to exclude illegal drug users and transvestites from this act.
Yeah, people with AIDS and HIV were really targeted as a group of people that they wanted to discriminate and keep out. And so I also don't think we think about how how diseases play a role in this, because we think of diseases only in terms of mobility, right? Or someone who's in a wheelchair. We don't think about the other ways in that people are impacted by their diseases or crippled by their diseases. And so, yeah, but of course, it's always there. And the 90s is a big moment when we're talking about AIDS and HIV. Everyone's trying to box out these marginalized groups.
There's this idea of deserving disability and undeserving disability that very much becomes part of the debate.
Yeah, which scans, I think, in many ways to other civil rights movements. And so, I think when we think about George H.W. Bush, certainly a champion of this. He, I think was obviously Reagan's VP, but he came back around to this legislation, was brought back around to this legislation. John Lewis saw the connection here to his civil rights battles, but it also seems like Orrin Hatch played a big role in here and may have been someone who actually saved it, in particular when Jesse Helms was trying to scuttle it along those lines that we just described. Orrin Hatch kind of swooped in, and a Republican senator kind of swooped in and helped get final passage.
It's such a snapshot of a different time, isn't it? Because it really is this bipartisan bill that's being championed by the president, then George H.W. Bush. Bush had been approached by activists in 1986 when he was still vice president. They reached out to him, and he sort of innately understood, because he had a child with disabilities who had died. He had another child who had some issues around learning. And so he got why this was necessary and becomes a champion for it. And so it is Republicans and Democrats together who pass what was one of the biggest, if not the biggest, piece of civil rights legislation since the 1960s. And that moment of possibility is going to close pretty quickly as we get further into the 90s. But at this moment, it actually is a profound political moment where people are actually working together.
Yeah, almost unanimous. I kind of want to know who are the people that were like, nope.
Jesse Helms.
Really? Well, yeah, Jesse Helms. But just wow. I think something like this, even coming up today, you wonder what, given the stark, polemical divide, how many people would still be for something like this. It's kind of same thing we think of Martin Luther King's birthday. You think it would have been unanimous, and it's not. The ADA is also one of those things where we assume that everyone would have been on board, and not necessarily everyone was.
Yeah. Upon final passage of the bill, Senator Tom Harkin delivered a Senate floor speech in ASL and was the first in ASL to be delivered on the Senate floor. And so, we've touched on this a little bit, but we're actually going to do another episode after this on George H.W. Bush, something much sillier. And certainly I don't think anything that adds to, that helps us consider his legacy. But this certainly does, right? And I think we've mentioned his handling of the AIDS crisis, and I think in many ways the shameful way that Reagan and Bush treated the AIDS epidemic. And then you have this. And so I think there's a real mixed legacy here. But do you have any thoughts on kind of how this fits into the way that we should look back at the one-term Bush presidency?
Look, he has two kind of huge achievements. It's this and helping to manage the end of the Cold War. And both of those he gets a lot of credit for. His record on civil rights otherwise is pretty dismal. He's leading the charge against political correctness as president, and he vetoes a civil rights bill that would have protected Black Americans and women the same year. So he's got a pretty mixed record, but this is a really important part of his legacy and one of the high points of his administration.
It's funny, though, that he uses the same metaphor with each high point, which is, Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And then for the ADA, it's let the shameful wall of exclusion finally come tumbling down. So maybe that's all he's got going for him. But
big 4 years for walls coming down.
It is interesting to me that, at least in terms of America, maybe outside of Bush, America really is the first country to have this comprehensive civil rights declaration for people with disabilities. And so I feel like it leads the way for other countries to adopt the same sort of policy, because disability is everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that quote is remarkable in that there was a time when there was a Republican president who was anti-wall and
wild times, Jody.
at least rhetorically had bad things to say about walls. Anyway, we will leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
I felt that a lot of people with disabilities could be wonderfully productive citizens if some of the laws were changed. And so it was an easy call for me. And besides that, I had a wonderful team who had deep convictions on this subject. And the result was the ADA.
Radiotopia.